kind. So, the data that we collected, we first collected this data on the left-hand side of the screen. We first collected it 3 years ago. We've been updating it each year, and earlier this year, The Economist magazine in the UK asked us to do a special piece for them, which is where I've taken this slide from, the chart from. Basically, if you look at our country, right, we've now created an economy. We've created an economy where the 20 largest companies account for nearly 70% of the nation's profits, right? And it's worth just looking at this chart and seeing how our economy has evolved since liberalization. So when the country was opened up in 1991-92, the top 20 companies of that era. So the top 20 companies on the BSE in 91-92 was Hindustan Motors, Premier Padmini, Mafatlal, Century Textiles. These sorts of firms accounted for around 15% of the nation's profits in that era, 15%. Even if you look at, say, 2010 on the chart on the left, even in 2010, the top 20 companies accounted for a mere 30% of the country. By the way, in America today, the top 20 companies account for around 30-35% of America's profits, right? And then in the last 10 years, you'll see in that chart on the left, just see the blue line rockets up. It almost goes vertical. So in FY19, the top 20 companies accounted for 62%. In FY20, they accounted for 70%, right? The FY20 data is not on this slide, but FY20, the top 20 companies accounted for 70%. And I suspect when the results for this COVID impacted year come out, I suspect the top 20 companies this year will account for 80-85% of the country's profits. Obviously, this is a skewed year, but it sort of serves to illustrate the point that over the last 10 years, the strong have got stronger. Now, why has this happened? Why is our country at one level so blessed to have around 20 giant companies who take home 70-80% of the nation's profits, right? One part of the answer is on the slide, on the right-hand side, right? You see our country.
Hello.
Our country is unique in that. If you see the Indian economy, it's unique in that in every sector, one or two companies take home around 80-85% of the sector's profits. I've given you several examples on the screen on the right hand side. I could give you another list of another 10-15 companies who are like this. The data that we get, the data on the left, shows that we are the most monopolized large economy in the world, and in a way the data on the right illustrates why. But there's another way to understand the situation, and we'll move forward to understand that. So if I take the 13 monopolists who are part of our flagship portfolio, we've got three different portfolios in the firm, but the flagship portfolio, the consistent compounder portfolio, has 13 stocks. What we've seen over the last, whether it's the last year, FY20, I'm looking at the right-hand side of this chart, right-hand side of the slide. Whether I take the last year, FY20, the last 3 years, the last 5 years, what you tend to see in India is that the typical Indian monopolist grows his or her business by 20%. The typical Indian monopolist grows profits by 20%, grows capital employed by 20%. The whole scale of the operation grows incrementally at 20% a year. That's the right-hand side of the slide. And the result of that is the left-hand side of the slide. The left-hand side of the slide is showing that the share price compounding is also 20%, right? So whether we take the last 3 years or the last 5 years, the Indian monopolist share prices compound at 20%. Clearly, the Nifty doesn't do that. The Nifty neither compounds earnings nor share price at 20%. The BSE 500 doesn't do that. And interestingly, if you go to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, add up the profits of the top 20,000 Indian companies, 6,000 listed, 14,000 unlisted, over the last decade, the top 20,000 Indian companies profits, excluding the top 20 monopolists, have grown at 1% per annum. So in the same country where GDP growth is 6%, nominal GDP growth is around 10%, the top 20 monopolists grow their profits at 20%. Everybody else that you and I know grows their profits at 1% per annum, right? So there's clearly a big difference between the monopolist and everybody else. In the same country that others are growing at 1%, the monopolist grows at 20%. So how can we become monopolists? How can we think like monopolists, right? Now, whilst we've written books on India, One book which really set us thinking about this whole subject 5-6 years ago was Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, right? So I'll give you some of the ideas from the book, but if you really want to, and if you're really interested in this subject and you love thinking and building monopolies, then the video on the bottom of the slide is a must watch. So it's basically the 0 to 1 book turned into a 1 hour video, and it's easy to watch. Just go to YouTube and you can watch it there. On YouTube, the title of the video is "Competition is for Losers," right? And you can understand why competition is for losers as per Peter Thiel, because he's saying that look, all failed companies, and 99.9% of companies have failed in the Thiel construct because these companies have failed to escape competition. His point is that the central purpose of building a business is to beat the competition and build a monopoly. If you're just going to compete, to what's the fun in that? You'll never make a return on capital above cost of capital, and it's like a pretty miserable existence. Now, how do you then build a monopoly? I'll give you the Thiel recipe as he's articulated it. Then I'll give you the Indian promoter recipe. The Indian promoter recipe thoda sa different hai. Thiel and the Indian promoter are slightly different. Thank you. Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. Yeah, so the Indian promoter's recipe is slightly different from Thiel, but let me first discuss Thiel, then I'll come on to the Indian promoter. What Thiel is saying is the classical construct he believes to build a monopoly is identify a unserved market, narrow unserved market. In plain English, identify a niche that others can't see, enter the niche, and then build entry barriers around it, right? Entry barriers around, colonize the niche, monopolize the niche, right? And he cites as an example Amazon. So if you read Jeff Bezos' The Everything Store, he famously describes there that in 95, I think, 95, he quit D. Shaw in New York and drove across the country to Seattle, where with some angel funding, he set up the Amazon books business. Why did Bezos start with the books business? Because he looked at the conventional bookstore model in America and realized that the conventional bookstore model was flawed. It was flawed because the conventional bookstore in America can only carry, say, 10,000 books. And at any given point in time, the US market is buying 10x as many books, right? This 10x thing will come back to. It's very interesting. 10x. This is the famous Thiel power law. So he said, look, I can do something which is 10x better. I can have a bookshop which will have 10x as many books as Barnes and Noble, and you won't have to drive in your car to the supermarket or the local shopping strip. You can just sit at home and buy 10 times as many books as a typical Barnes and Noble can sell to you. So with angel funding, he built the Amazon books business. That was his first monopoly. Then he moved in concentric circles outwards. We'll come back to this concept again, concentric circles outwards. After books, he went after CDs, right? Same construct. So when I was a teenager in the UK, we used to go to the local CD store, HMV ka CD store hota tha. Obviously, the local CD store contained at most 2,000 CDs, whereas the market itself was 10 times larger. So Bezos first wrecked the books industry by bringing Amazon into the picture, books. Then he went after the music industry, right? In my own lifetime, I've seen the famous record shops in London and New York disappear, courtesy Amazon's monopolization. After that, he moved to broader US retail. So books, CDs, broader US retail. After broader US retail done, he moved to European retail. Uske baad, Asian retail, right? Concentric circles, right? And another man who's done the same formula is a friend of Peter Thiel, in fact, co-founder with Peter Thiel in PayPal, Elon Musk and Tesla, right? So Tesla did not start with the family sedan, right? They didn't start with the sedan. They started with a niche model, the Roadster, niche sports car, $110,000 ticket, clearly focusing on a niche market. Once they nailed the sports car market, then they moved to the Model S, the sedan, which is now their best-selling model. And again, it's the same construct. Monopolize a niche, chota sa market, then you move in concentric circles outward. So why does Thiel recommend this modus operandi, this standard operating procedure? His point is that if you first start with a narrow niche market, you need less cash, right? Not only do you need less money, you can also try out various things. You're still building your team, you're trying out various team members, you're testing out your technology, your business processes, and all of this you can do in a lower risk, lower cost environment, lower cash burn environment by focusing on a niche. So in a way, niches are where monopolists are kind of born, right? Niches are where monopolists are born. They perfect their ideas, their processes, their team, their basically working capital cycle, and then once they're fully muscled up, they move outwards in concentric circles, right? And one of the key things he emphasizes is there's nothing called first mover advantage, right? That's a Lallu concept, right? The relevant concept is building up your barriers to entry, building up your business processes, and if anything, there's a last mover advantage, right? And a lot of what Thiel says, right? You'll see across the world, including our country, a lot of business people don't follow this. Now, let's move to Indian monopolists, right? They obviously weren't waiting for Thiel to come along. 40 years before Peter Thiel came along, Indian monopolists figured out how to build their own version of monopolies. So how does the Desi monopolist do it? The Desi monopolist does a slight variant on Thiel. It's not so much niche. They do sometimes target niches. What they do is they attack the most challenging aspect of the sector. Right, so if they're setting up an NBFC, they won't just be doing the same straightforward NBFC. They will moat the NBFC. They'll attack the NBFC business problem in a way nobody else has thought of. They'll deliberately do it in a way which is hard to replicate. Right. Once they have built the initial moat, they'll keep adding layers of difficulty to it, so that nobody else can compete with them. Right, and if you read my books, there are several examples given. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll just cite one example, which is Asian Paints. Right, so Asian Paints is a classic replication of this flow chart that I put in front of you. So back in the 60s, ICI, now AkzoNobel, us zamane ka ICI, used to rule the roost. Their product was Dulux. Still, even to this day, Dulux is the best paint available in the Indian market. And Asian Paints realized that they could not compete with Dulux on quality. The obvious area that everybody says is, let me produce a really high quality product and that'll be my moat. That's not a clever idea. Right? So Asian Paints realized that on chemistry, they could not compete with the British guys. So they targeted the distribution construct, and they specifically said, we will focus on building barriers to entry around distribution using technology. And thus came the famous purchase in 1970 by Champaklal Choksi of India's first supercomputer, when he spent 8 crore rupees, which in 1970 was a fortune, to buy India's first supercomputer. And he put in place the distribution moat, which still makes Asian Paints an invincible money machine, right? One of the greatest compounders in the planet in the last 40 years, built around a technology moat. But that's not enough. As the distribution moat of Asian Paints gathered steam through the 70s and 80s, right, their cash flow, their return on equity far exceeded the return on capital employed, the return on equity far exceeded that of competition. Free cash flow is nothing other than return on capital minus cost of capital. So through the 80s, Asian Paints found that it was generating way more cash than the competition was. So they used that to make it even harder for other companies to compete with them. So an example of how they made it even harder, and in fact it happens every year now. So now that I've figured out the paradigm in Marcellus, we keep seeing every year how Asian Paints makes it harder and harder and harder for people to compete with them. So for example, in 1995, they increased the SKUs in the paint industry by a factor of 50. Right, so they figured out that others were figuring out the distribution construct. In specific, Berger, to this day, Berger is the only credible competitor they really have. Berger was figuring out the Asian Paints ka data-driven distribution mode. So Asian Paints said, I will step on it and I'll increase the level of difficulty by increasing the SKUs. So I'll have paints which are waterproof, paints which are disinfectant wala paints which are sunlight resistant, paints which are rain resistant, etc., etc. Deliberately juice up the number of SKUs in the industry so that it becomes even harder for competition to keep up with me. Because I have technology, I can deal with more SKUs easier, others can't. And you might have seen in the last 4 months, the next leg of making it difficult, Asian Paints has said that they bought an interior decoration business. So they're going to formalize the interior decoration industry. So rather than typically people like me, rather my wife calls other interior decorators who are chota mom and pop businesses, Asian Paints is going to formalize the interior decoration business Why do they want to formalize the interior decoration business? You can guess it, right? Once they become the monopoly provider of interior decoration, the entire house, not just paint, floor, tiling, toilet, kitchen, sab kuch is in Asian Paints' control, right? That's how a great monopolist thinks. Keep adding layers of difficulty, keep slamming the competition year after year, and you continue compounding great wealth, right? Now, if you were to take the best from the East and the West and create a recipe, learning from Thiel, learning from the great Indian promoters that we have covered in Unusual Billionaires, if you had to create a recipe of 7 things that great promoters do, I would say right at the top is what I call the secret, right? Every great monopoly has at its core a secret. So in some cases, the secret is well known in the sense that, you know, all of us know that Coke monopoly is predicated on a recipe, on a syrup that only they know. It sits in some vault in Atlanta, and if you and I knew the syrup, we would the formula recipe of the syrup, we would be able to produce Coke. But unfortunately, we don't, and thus the Coke monopoly, right? Similarly, we know that in Google's case, there is a search engine algo that only they have, which makes them a great search engine that others cannot copy, etc. Right? But in a very similar way, at the heart of Asian Paints or Divi's Lab or Nestle or Dr. Lal Path Labs, there's a secret. The promoter is not going to come on a TV or give a press conference saying, I'm going to tell you the secret. Why should he? He's worked his entire life to figure out the secret. But it's incumbent on investors, analysts to figure this out. If you don't figure it out, you might as well forget about investing in these companies, right? So that's the first leg, is the secret. The second is the translation of that secret into a business process, into a technology which allows the monopolist to work 10x better than the rival. This is the famous Thiel power law, that then between the number one and the number two, if the number one is genuinely a monopolist, he'll be doing something critical to the success of that product, which is 10x better. So for example, in the case of Divi's Lab, their error rate in the flaw rate in their API is 1/10 that of the competition, right? So Divi's Lab produces nearly 3/4 of the world's painkiller API. One of the reasons the world's largest pharma companies order from Divi's Lab, they get their API from Divi's Lab, not from Joe Schmo down the road, even though Joe Schmo is cheaper down the road, because Divi's Lab ka error rate is 1 in a million. Other Indian API manufacturer is more like 1 in 10,000, right? Similarly, if you take, say, Dr. Lal Path Labs, right? We've sort of drilled deep into the company a couple of years ago, and we realized that the whole process of doing a blood test, right? The ingredients, the testing, by generating scale efficiencies in procurement, and by building a very clever hub and spoke network, which again is driven by big data, they're basically able to get the job done at around 1/8 the cost of the competition, right? As a result, it's a no competition industry. Dr. Lal Path Labs does the same job, blood test, urine test, whatever it is, 1/8 cheaper than the competition, right? Third leg is getting the timing right. So you or I, as a monopolist, we might have a great secret. We might have turned it into a superb business process, a technology that nobody else has. But if we haven't timed it, if we haven't gauged whether the market has adequate demand for that, then unfortunately our efforts might not bear fruit. And an example of this is the Tata Nano. Right? It's difficult to argue that Tata Nano as a product was a bad product, right? It's a fuel efficient car. It didn't really break down that much. It was a decent product, but my reckoning is it was a decade too early, and it was actually quite a shame that it fizzled out, because clearly there was and remains a market for a fuel efficient small car in the Indian market, right? Then we come to point 4, which we have discussed before: capture a niche market and then move in concentric circles outward. So Pidilite is a super example. 1970 to 2000, they monopolized the Fevicol wala industry, adhesives industry. 2000, they entered the waterproofing industry through 2 acquisitions, M-Seal and Dr. Fixit. The next 20 years, 2000 to 2020, they monopolized the waterproofing industry, right? So both in adhesives and in waterproofing, Pidilite accounts for 90% of the profits generated in these sectors. And over the last couple of years, they've started building monopoly number 3, which is specialist flooring, tiling for, say, my house or for hospitals, for sports stadiums. And if you see the annual report, every 3-4 months, they're acquiring a company which is either a producer of specialist flooring or an EPC contractor for the same, right? Classic monopoly paradigm, moving monopoly after monopoly. So a different way to think about it is the geographical aspect. I gave you the Amazon example of concentric circles geographically. Dr. Lal Path is doing very similar. NCR monopoly first, fortress franchise in NCR, and then sort of moving concentric circles outwards through the northern Indian hinterland towards the Kolkata market, towards the Bengal market. Same construct, but different. Same construct as Amazon, but applied obviously in a very different landscape. Fifth area for monopoly, for building a monopoly, distribution and sales, right? If you ask me, right, fundamentally one of the biggest differences I think between building a monopoly in the West and building a monopoly in India is, in India, it's even more possible. It's even more possible for you and me to build monopolies around distribution and sales because of the messed up logistics in our country. Because of the messed up logistics in our country, selling in India, selling, marketing, distribution, every facet of going to market is actually very expensive in our country. So a big part of success in our industry, whether it's in asset management, NBFCs, is this whole distribution, selling, marketing monopoly. And HDFC asset, I would submit to you that HDFC asset is a monopoly because of their distribution sales strength, right? So a lot of people mistakenly think that an asset management firm lives or dies by performance and alpha shalpha. That doesn't seem to be true, right? If you look at HDFC assets strength over the last 20 years, it hasn't been driven on performance. It's been driven by superior franchise when it comes to distribution and selling, right? Literally, this company outsells its competitors by a multiple of threes to one on a day-to-day basis. You go to places like Dhanbad, Asansol, Kolhapur, Sholapur. When we speak to IFAs in these places, they say that the person who walks off the street comes and says, "Mere ko HDFC ka fund do." Right? You try to present performance, etc. They say, "We don't care. We believe in the HDFC brand name, and that's what we'll buy. Performance 8%, 9%, theek hai, de do fund." Right? That's these aspects, right? Understanding the relevance of the product, and this is where I think Deepak Parekh's genius. Deepak Parekh figured out 20 years ago that fund management in India was more about trust and brand rather than about alpha. Right? If you would, got a fellow like me who's grown up in the West, I would have said, fund management business chalega, performance pay. Deepak Parekh, 100x brighter than me, figured out that a fund management industry is fundamentally predicated on trust, faith, and brand, and they've done a super job there. So that's what those are the things to do. Equally important in building a monopoly is what to avoid, right? And this I find this list even more interesting than the preceding list. So one of the best ways to identify monopolies is in what they don't do. And you'll never see a great monopolist in a pricing war or a publicity war, right? They won't be doing ad campaigns, shouting at you from the front page of newspapers. They won't be doing pricing wars. As soon as you see a pricing war, guarantee hai ki wahan pe monopoly nahi hai. Pricing war is a guarantee that there is no monopoly there. People are thrashing about because they have no barriers to entry. They have no monopoly. And you as a investor, as a minority shareholder, are obviously going to be at a disadvantage. Second thing that monopolists never do is try to be disruptive. They aren't in any confrontational mode. They're not trying to screw anybody else's happiness. The monopolist thinks that either I have spotted an unserved market, which I will go and conquer. There's nobody to disrupt. I'm just going to conquer the market. Or there's a market which is currently being served in a different way. I have figured out through a secret, through a technology, a process, a different way of serving the current market. Right? There is no question of taking on anybody. There's no competition. There's no disruption. There's no confrontation. And whenever you see these things, right? Competition, confrontation, price wars, publicity wars, there is no monopoly involved. It's just a usual day-to-day, zero-sum game where you and I won't make any money. Right? Another facet is this whole first mover fascination. I've discussed before why there is no great merit in being first mover unless you're serving an industry with great network economics, where network effects are very, very powerful. It's not obvious to me there's a first mover advantage in doing anything. Another very bizarre thing, and this is I think especially true in our country, is this fascination with thinking that MBAs can be monopolists, MBAs can be entrepreneurs. Right? MBAs are classically trained to give lots and lots of exams and fight the conventional corporate battle, right? There are people who've self-selected themselves as, I'll get good marks in exams, and then I'll fight for the jobs in the most prestigious firms, then I'll fight for promotion. They're obviously conformists. These are people who linearly rise to great glory in corporate setups. MBAs very rarely make monopolists, right? Monopolist is necessarily somebody who thinks about the world differently, who's not interested in conventional paradigms, who's interested in coming up with ways of doing business that others simply can't imagine, and hence the MBA and the monopolist tends to be mutually exclusive, right? I won't go through the whole shopping list. You guys can read it. One part which I found to be very revealing is bullet 6. So looking at the promoters' compensation and their lifestyle, we have found is very, very revealing. It's to this day, in my 12 years in India, I haven't come across a monopolist who owns cricket teams, football teams, Formula One teams, who shows off his wealth or her wealth, or who turns up and with film stars and red carpet events and so on. Almost all the great monopolists that we've seen in India that we've invested in. By the way, one disclaimer: all of these are portfolio companies of Marcellus. So yes, I have a vested interest in telling you this. We've invested in all these stocks. If you want to invest in them, that's your prerogative. But please do your own work before you invest in these stocks. Don't say Saurabh presented, maine khareed liya, and then shout that I missold you. So we've invested in these stocks. It's up to you whether you want to invest. But one clear thing I've seen with great monopolists is they'll be immensely wealthy, but they will not make a show of their wealth. And I think the best example I find in the city I live in Mumbai, is Uday Kotak. He's the world's richest banker, but he lives a very, what should I say, professional middle class lifestyle. He lives in a flat. Obviously, his flat is a little bigger than my flat, but he lives in a flat. And I haven't seen him, buy cricket teams or badminton teams. I don't think he'll have any problem affording any. But it's not the sort of thing a monopolist does. His mind, from what I can make out, is about how do I get a move on the competition? How do I pull away even further from the competition in the banking sector? And this, I think, is a characteristic of monopolists. Their brain simply is not interested in the conventional signals of success, which is flashing your wealth and showing off your wealth, Egyptian pharaoh style, by building pyramids. And if you guys are interested in the subject, there's a book by a guy called René Girard, French philosopher called René Girard. It's about a subject called mimesis. And what mimesis says is, all of us, most of us, rather 99.9% of us, figure out what to do in life by copying others, imitating others, watching others, right? So it's called mimetic desire, because I'm miming you, I'm copying you. So I want to have a flat in a posh area in Bombay because that's the thing to do. I want to send my kids to fancy universities abroad because that's what everybody does. I covet a certain car or a watch or a lifestyle because that's what everybody does, right? And mimesis is a very common feature in human life. Very little of what most of us do, myself included, very little of what we do is actually original. What distinguishes a monopolist at the most psychological level, and this is the subject I've delved into in the Victory Project, is the ability to break away from this type of thinking. A monopolist is able to break away from the mimetic paradigm, and that's the sort of psychological aspect. Now let's come back to the real world and just do one example, and then I'll stop yapping. Right, sorry. Yeah, the PowerPoint is not really, yeah. So let's do this example, then I'll stop. So this, I think, I find Bajaj Finance a picture perfect case study of how to build a monopoly in what everybody thinks is a super competitive industry, how to build a monopoly from scratch. So the story began 12 years ago, and the story began with my erstwhile neighbor joining Bajaj Finance, right? So 2008, Bajaj Finance's loan book was all of 2,500 crores, of which half was Bajaj Auto Ka financing. So it was a very small loan book. And Rajiv Jain, Sanjeev Bajaj, and the late great Nanu Pamnani joined forces, right? And they joined forces to figure out how to build a successful NBFC. And right at the outset, they figured that they wanted to build a business model that nobody else could emulate, nobody else could copy, right? So how to build an NBFC that others can't copy? the obvious answer moved in the direction of technology, credit assessment, credit underwriting in a way that is hard to emulate. Now, who exactly came up with this insight of this troika of gentlemen, I don't know. I suspect it was Danu Bhamnani, but I can't be 100% sure. But our reckoning is between 2010 and 2015, Bajaj Finance collected at least 10 times more data on the 200, 300 million most affluent people in our country than anybody else, right? So for all of us who are on the Zoom call, I can confidently tell you, Bajaj Finance knows more about all of us on this call. Bajaj Finance knows more about us than anybody else in the country, right? Now, basis that a superior collection of big data, Rajiv Jain then did the analytics, and he started identifying profit pools that others couldn't identify. Right, that's the skill of the monopolist. Right, you can give the same data to 25 other NBFCs, they won't be able to figure out how to mine the data. Rajiv's team, they have I think 150 data analysts now, but back in 2010, 2011, 2012, I don't think their data analyst team was at that large. It was really a question of insight, and I think the insight came from the big man. So they started identifying pools of borrowers who were low risk, but others couldn't spot them. So the first pool they spotted was doctors and dentists, right? There are around 10 lakh doctors and dentists in the country. Bajaj Finance saw that these were low risk borrowers for obvious reasons, right? The cash flows of doctors and dentists are fairly stable. They were low risk borrowers, but the banks treated them as SMEs and hence charged them higher rates of interest. So Bajaj said, we will target and lend aggressively to this segment. Within 2-3 years, they collected more data on doctors and dentists than obviously anybody else had in India. And then came the second barrier to entry, which is stratifying this data, and putting it into 600 different risk buckets. So, for example, they said that if a doctor comes from a top 20 medical school, we will give him a superior score, and if he comes from a bottom 20 medical school, then we'll give him a lesser score. If she's an oncologist, then better score. If a cosmetic surgeon, then say lower score. If her clinic is in Bandra, then better score, and if the clinic is say in Sholapur, then lower score. So just to put it all together, if a doctor is from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences practicing oncology in Bandra, Bajaj Finance said we'll roll out the red carpet, the best possible rates. But if he's a graduate from a third-rate medical school practicing in the middle of nowhere and doing cosmetic surgery, then obviously much higher interest rates will be charged to said doctor. Now, as soon as they did it, the barrier to entry was very formidable, because now if tomorrow morning Saurabh Mukherjea says I also want to lend to doctors and dentists, obviously I don't have that sort of data. So what will I do? I'll offer an average interest rate. At that average interest rate, the AIMS doctor in Bandra is not going to borrow from Saurabh because I'll be too expensive for her. But the cosmetic surgeon in the middle of nowhere will borrow from Saurabh because Saurabh will be offering an attractive rate to the cosmetic surgeon. So this is called adverse selection. My entry into the doctor financing industry will attract from Bajaj their highest risk customers. And my entry paradoxically will improve the quality of Bajaj's book. Right. So in true Thiel style, they perfected their data analyst, their analytics, their collection systems in this industry, doctors, dentists. Then they moved in concentric circles outwards. Uske baad lawyers, chartered accountants, architects, and so on. So today they are the largest financiers. Bajaj Finance is the largest lender to the self-employed white-collar industry in our country, right? Then came the third layer of the barrier to entry, which was the largest consumer durables book in the country. Some in substance, what I'm trying to drive at is the reason Bajaj Finance delivers 25% ROE when no other NBFC can even cross 15-16% is not because they take higher risk. In fact, they take less risk than any other NBFC in the country. And I'll give you two metrics to understand this. Bajaj Finance's debt equity ratio is 5 times, peer average is 10. Right? So with half the gearing, they have ROE which is twice as large. One last factoid. Most NBFCs in India, actually all NBFCs in India, borrow short term, lend long term, right? This is the norm the world over. They borrow in the 1-year CP market and lend 5-year, 20-year money. Bajaj Finance borrows 4-year money, lends long term. So they do what is called reverse ALM. So with less ALM risk, with less debt equity, with the lowest NPA metrics in this industry over the last 5-6 years, you get the highest ROEs. And that is the secret of the Indian monopolist. The Indian monopolist, the unusual billionaire, generates the best returns with the lowest risk. And that, in a way, is the essence of monopolist thinking. Thinking about the industry in a completely different way and building a business process around technology, around analytics, and around genuine business insight, which nobody else has. So that's the roadmap that we've figured out on how to build monopolists. Most of what I told you is in these 3 books that you see on the screen. If you want the global perspective on this, then these are the 3 best books I've seen on a global basis on how to build monopolists. 0 to 1 we discussed. The book on the right was published 7-8 months ago. It's incredibly hard hitting. They've really gone hammer and tongs. The book on the right, they've gone hammer and tongs at Google and Facebook and so on, which is why it hasn't been publicized widely in the media, but really well written book by Jonathan Tepper if you want to understand how the great American monopolies have been built. So I'll stop there.